So the last time a party in Congress officially designated the other party a terrorist organization, we were in the middle of a civil war. So that hasn't happened in over 150 years. Typically, the parties argue about things. Sometimes they get mad. They call each other names. Sometimes they get really mad and call each other really bad names. But one thing they don't do is use law enforcement to crush, harass, arrest voters on the other side, because that's not democracy. That's tyranny. But we've just moved one step closer to tyranny. In fact, we may already be there, thanks to what the House is calling an anti-domestic terrorism bill, as if murder wasn't illegal already. It just passed the House, and it instructs the FBI to, quote, analyze and monitor domestic terrorist activity. So how are we defining that? Well, of course, we're not defining that. It instructs the FBI, in other words, the largest law enforcement organization in the United States, to monitor Joe Biden's critics. It dramatically expands the definition of domestic terror to include hate crimes, whatever those are. It also mandates that the FBI and the DOJ conduct an assessment to determine whether white supremacists have, quote, infiltrated federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Now, what's a white supremacist? They don't define that either. So if you're going to pass a law that empowers people with guns to make arrests, you probably should define your terms. Otherwise, it will be abused, unless the law was designed to be abused, and this one was. So under this law, these law enforcement agencies must issue biannual domestic terrorism reports to Congress with a focus on the threat, quote, posed by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, because it turns out the only form of race discrimination in the country comes from one group, and they don't vote for Democrats. That's the whole point. That's why the bill doesn't mention BLM or Antifa or black nationalists. And as we said, it doesn't define white supremacy. And that's very odd, because white supremacy is the only thing lawmakers talked about as they voted on this bill.
Recent white supremacist attacks have reminded minority communities across the country of a dark history we have not yet escaped.
We have witnessed far too many other acts of domestic terrorism.
We are at an important crossroads in this country. With white supremacy on the rise and violent extremists fueling each other's bigotry and hate, we're seeing an alarming increase in domestic terrorism fueled by this hatred.
Now, keep in mind, when you hear people like that, and those are some of the worst and most limited people in our society, but still they're elected members of Congress, when you hear them attack white supremacists and white supremacy, you should know that their definition of those terms is probably different from yours. So if you were to quote Martin Luther King Jr., whose monument stands on the Mall, and say that the U.S. government ought to treat people based on who they are and what they do and not how they look and how they were born, should assess people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. If that's your position, you are by definition, according to the people you just saw, a white supremacist. This is scary. Congressman Cori Bush of Missouri spelled out the purpose of the bill, which of course is entirely political. Quote, the Republican Party has become the party of unfettered white supremacist violence. So there was only one Republican who voted for this bill, and that's a man who's become completely undone and whose total destruction as a man really does deserve your pity, and that's Adam Kinzinger. Here's why he said he voted for it.
People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, people like Matt Gaetz, Mo Brooks, the folks you think about, they are almost leading. Well, I would argue that they are leading the Republican caucus. And so Kevin McCarthy, Elise Stefanik, instead of leading, as their title, leadership, should suggest they do, they basically are tolerating this all in the name of hopefully I become speaker someday. You can't fundraise, you can't feed, you can't live on fear, because eventually you're going to create fearful people, and fearful people can do really bad things. And I think that's what we saw in Buffalo.
So they're continuing to tell you, in the face of all available evidence, that the mass murder you saw over the weekend in Buffalo was inspired by hateful right-wing rhetoric, when in fact that mass murder was committed by someone with diagnosed mental illness that the adults around him apparently ignored. Okay? So you saw a shooting by a crazy person that has been hijacked by partisan forces to crush political dissent, to attack civil liberties in this country. You should care about that.